You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 375 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I'm very excited to start off today's show by announcing that I am now the assistant opinion editor at antiwar.com. So this is a really cool opportunity for me. And I'm sure the experience of working with Scott Horton and Eric Garris over there is going to only make the show's content even better. I'm going to be doing this at least through the summer. And so that means the shows may be coming out a little bit late, or they'll probably be on the shorter side, closer to 20 minutes than 30 minutes. You know, I'm picking up some time commitments here. And, that obviously is taking priority over pretty much anything else. And that means that the show's out late, it's out late. But again, with this experience, the show's only going to be getting better as time goes on. I'm also still doing the news roundup over at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and the news roundup are both featured on the homepage. But those are probably going to be a little bit shorter over the next couple months, just as I have that other role to work in. But I am keeping up with the news. I'm going to continue to bring it to you on the show, so I'm looking forward to that. Share the show, subscribe to the show somewhere. Ratings and reviews are all things that you guys could do to help me along. In this marketplace of like podcasting and ideas and talking foreign policy, I'm really, promoting myself as my brand. So, everything that, goes into sharing the show and ratings and reviews and everything just helps to promote myself even more, which gets all my work out there, not just, what I'm doing either in my news roundup or the show, but just, working with the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com. So make sure you're promoting everything I'm doing. And as always, I appreciate it. And then I am doing monthly live streams for the patrons. I'm looking at the 24th of July. I'm going to do 9 o'clock Eastern again. That way the West Coast people have a chance to hop in. 1 hour. I'll post the link on the Patreon page and in the Foreign Policy Focus Facebook group. And then everybody could hop in and ask questions if you got it, or, comment on whatever you want foreign policy wise. All right. Well, enough with the introduction here. Let's get into some news. There is some rumors out, and I guess these are pretty substantial. They're saying 5 unnamed sources, which is more than the usual unnamed sources. And the people that are covering this story make me think that, Dan Coates may actually be on his way out as Director of National Intelligence. Now, remember, the Director of National Intelligence is a role that I think Trump initially just wanted to get rid of. It was something I believe created after 9/11, along with the kind of like the Department of Homeland Security, to bring all the intelligence agencies together, when in reality, Trump is probably right. It just had an extra layer of bureaucracy. And in a lot of ways, I think that is true, except this is now a position with power. And so, ordering investigations are all negative things the Director of National Intelligence could do, working up bogus intelligence assessments, another source for the media to be able to claim a U.S. intelligence, a high-ranking intelligence official says Russia did this, or Iran did this, or North Korea is working on this. So it's even more important that we really one day eliminate that position, although probably never happen. As far as it goes as Director of National Intelligence, I'm sure somebody could have been worse than Dan Coates, but anytime his name came up on the show, he was always, for the most part, talking about pretty awful things the U.S. should be doing, in intelligence, asserting bogus lies about the enemies, the intelligence community, along with Dan Coates, is trying to create. Now, the bad news here is that Dan Coates, who may not have been the absolute worst, although, was terrible, could be replaced by somebody much worse. A name being floated around is Fred Fleitz. He's a guy that runs around with John Bolton, but also hangs around with the likes of Frank Gaffney, and so seems like a very dangerous person. His name has come up on the show in the past. Joanne Leon talked about him in the episode about John Bolton, how he was kind of going out in the media really trying to promote Bolton. So there's kind of a negative in two sense here. One is if this guy ends up with the job, he's another real Iran hawk. And there's a good article by Curt in The Spectator, and I'll link to that in the show notes page for those of you to read kind of more of this guy's history. and personal dust-ups with Curt Mills. And then also, I think it suggests that John Bolton may be a little bit more powerful in the Trump administration than people have recently been speculating, saying that, with the failures of North Korea, being marooned to Mongolia during the DMZ meeting, maybe John Bolton is on his way out. However, Trump's appointing an ally of Bolton. I think it's fairly safe to assume that means that Bolton's advocating for him and, likely a big cheerleader. John Bolton, I mean, he's been out there cheerleading Bolton in the media. So I would guess that this suggests that Bolton has the ear of Trump more than, some people have recently suggested. But who knows? This is all pretty much speculation on unnamed sources. And, when you have the reporting of somebody like Curt Mills, you give it a little bit more credibility than, some of these Washington Post hats. A couple stories in the U.S. dealing with the police. One is an entire episode I dedicated to the murder of Daniel Shaver by the Mesa, Arizona Police Department, where if you remember back, and this was absolutely brutal, but I will link to the episode in the show notes page. The police, had a drunk Mr. Shaver and leave his hotel room and then try to have him crawl while keeping his hands at some time above his head towards the police officers. And when his pants were being dragged down, he reached back to, pull him up so his ass wasn't falling out. One of the officers, I believe his name was Bradford, shot him dead. And so anybody who watched that video knew this was absolutely a murder, and not just the shooter, but the commander in charge and all the officers who are either giving conflicting or confusing orders are none of them for standing up and saying, hey guys, this dude is, drunk and sobbing and doesn't understand our orders. Let's just go over there and put his hands behind his back rather than having him do this elaborate, degrading, impossible task of trying to drag himself, apparently, without his hands across the carpet in this disgusting hotel hallway. Anyways, of course, the police officer isn't convicted. Surprise, surprise. And he says he has PTSD from the incident. And when this all came out, the police department, I believe, or the city tried to fire him, and he appealed and then worked out a sweetheart deal with the police department where he was going to get $2,500 a month for the rest of his life in retirement for the medical trauma that he suffered by shooting Mr. Shaver. The other story I have is this Florida police officer who has now been found to have planted drugs on possibly dozens, if not more people. Apparently this guy was just driving around and dropping meth in anybody who he pulled over. Seatbelt violation, pulls you over, drops some meth in your seat. They say, yeah, I trust you to search my purse. I don't have anything in there. Boom, he pulls out meth. And all these people are, devastated and, it ruins their life. How could there possibly be meth in here? One guy loses his kid over this incident. People go to jail, legal fees, probably lost jobs, broken relationships. Of course, somebody thinks a cop found meth on you. Well, you're the one lying. Obviously, you're on drugs. You're some kind of junkie. Meth head was a popular, term for me growing up, that you wouldn't believe this guy. And here you have a nice uniformed police officer saying, I found the drugs. So, this guy who is just a liar because he likes drugs is lying. I think the reason it's important, even on a foreign policy show, to talk about stories like this is just to say, you have to question authority, right? One of the reasons these guys get away with it and are able to do it so much is because they wear badges and somehow get extra respect for it. And, it's that same kind of extra respect that unfortunately allows so many politicians to say, oh, if you oppose the wars, you oppose our troops, and we have to respect the troops higher than anyone. Or it's the same kind of respect that lets a war criminal, like that man who stabbed the detained ISIS fighter or fired blindly into crowds of innocent people. To the point, by the way, I don't think I talked about this last time on the show, but that story of the war criminal, I think his name is Gallagher. His own soldiers were jamming and making his rifle unable to fire because they were worried he was going to kill innocent people. And so, if you need any more kind of clear evidence that this guy is, seriously, has some mental and moral deficiencies and probably needs to be, if not behind bars, but just, for the rest of his life, removed from the rest of society, however you want to do that. It's clear if the soldiers are jamming his gun, especially because if they end up in combat, you assume you want his gun to fire. They're willing to risk that, so he's not driving around killing innocent people, because that's what he does. So anyways, we have to put dents into this, authority of the badge narrative that allows for so much of the atrocities committed, by the U.S. government, in the United States, but especially overseas. The Pentagon is now looking at putting together programs to develop rare earth mineral productions in the United States. They say there's a shortage of some of these minerals. Their importance for planes and tanks and a couple other pieces of military equipment. And so we have to ensure their production. The couple things I think are important here are they're looking at just giving out loans to people. So maybe it's time to invest in rare earth minerals, as it looks like the U.S. government may be dumping some millions of dollars into that industry. The other issue is that two of the places that people talk about when they talk about rare earth mineral production are Afghanistan and Africa. And in both places, they warn that, China is looking to encroach to kind of take over the market. And so while this could just be limited to these economic type of programs where, the Pentagon's taking our money and giving it away to contractors, and that's, unfortunate, terrible cronyism, it's also probably going to be excuses to, carry out special operations missions in Africa, stay in Afghanistan, counter China, whatever that means. These are the kind of policies that are going to develop around the Pentagon now having a mission to secure rare earth minerals. Speaking of Afghanistan, no matter how fake the narrative is that, the U.S. needs to be there to secure or keep China from getting rare earth minerals, U.S. soldiers keep dying, and that's the reality. And all of it, of course, on Donald Trump. We had the 7th U.S. soldier in 2019 die in Afghanistan. Of course, the number should be 0. There's no reason for the U.S. to be here at this point. We're in major talks with the Taliban right now about settling a peace agreement. If we could sit down in a room and talk with them for over 6 months and, have had 7 rounds of peace talks, well, then that probably means our soldiers don't need to be dying in that country. It's time to start withdrawing and coming home. Now, Trump had ordered a drawdown in that country, and I've read reports that is kind of going on to some extent behind the scenes, but not really. So who knows? The reports I've seen that, numbers in the hundreds, if not low thousands of troops would have left, but, certainly nothing to really make a dent or anything in the 14,000 or so U.S. troops that are already in the country. Just talking about how damaging that belief in authority narrative is, the soldier dying goes and adds to the narrative that the U.S. needs to stay in Afghanistan because, Americans keep dying there and our politicians tell us it's worth it, rather than everybody asking the politicians to tell them what the justification is for this soldier's death. They should be saying hey, one of our Americans, somebody in my family or community, one of my friends was killed here. Please explain to me why he died and what he's fighting for in Afghanistan 2019. Of course, nobody could do it. Or if they tried to, it would be somebody like Tim Ryan saying, well, Al-Qaeda is there, or, the Taliban attacked us on 9/11. I'm going to link to a story from Haaretz by Gordon Levy, and he discusses the impact of Israeli bombing, I believe in May, of Gaza City, where 2 apartment buildings, I think 7 stories high each, were destroyed. And he talks about the lives of the shopkeepers and the people who lived in the building and what happened to them, and how, they've become homeless. They've had to, sell all their assets. They've completely lost their businesses. The trauma that it caused people who, received a call from the Israeli military that you must leave this building right now because we're coming to blow it up. And so you had situations where, people would, women running out of the building in what they described as indecent amount of clothing, because, the Israelis are come to blow it up. Are you gonna, put on all of the layers that you need, or are you just gonna run outside because you don't want to be hit by a missile? And so that terror and trauma is well documented. It also somewhat is interesting just from a logistics standpoint of how these airstrikes take place, and the fact that people receive calls saying hey, you need to leave right now because we're going to blow this up. Is, first of all, that they have the contact information of who lives in these buildings, apparently somewhere on file to be able to, call the Israelis, not the Palestinians, and say that, hey, we're about to blow up one of your buildings. Is kind of crazy. But to me, it explains a little bit why sometimes a lot of airstrikes will happen. I don't think, some people should have died, but, nobody's ever counted the death toll. Well, if they're calling a warning beforehand, that explains some of it. Anyways, I hope everybody takes the time to read that article, just because it really humanizes the victims of the Israeli violence here. The UK plans to send a second warship, this time a destroyer, to the Persian Gulf. I assume that these ships would be escorting any kind of British cargo or British cargo ships heading through the region. Big news here is that Turkey has begun taking possession of the S-400 missile system. Best write-up on this so far goes to Moon of Alabama, so I'll link to that in the show notes page. What he argues is that the location of where Turkey is putting these missile systems is very important, and, one goes in the capital city, and the other one is apparently going along the Mediterranean Sea. And so this kind of points to something that I've been picking up in the news recently, in that rather than Turkey start to maybe become more aggressive in Syria or towards Israel or any of the Gulf Arab states, Turkey has become more aggressive kind of with their territory in North Cyprus and then the oil rights under the waters of the northern Mediterranean Sea. I think there's some kind of energy there that Turkey wants to develop. This is contested between a lot of countries. There's also territorial and island ownership issues between Turkey and Greece. And so the fact that Turkey is apparently putting this missile system in that direction, I think shows where some of Turkey's priorities are as far as weighing, their interest in the Mediterranean Sea versus their interest in Syria. Another important note in the Moon of Alabama article, the S-400 system that Russia develops in, usually the ones that people are talking about when they talk about the missile system, have a 400-kilometer range. The system that Turkey is getting only has a 250-kilometer range. The big question now is, what does the U.S. do? Turkey is going around saying, well, the U.S. doesn't have to sanction us. We know that importing the missile system is in violation of U.S. sanctions, but they don't have to put sanctions on Turkey because of it. And that is true, although those kind of arguments typically don't go well with the U.S. I will say that since the G20, where Trump, I believe, spoke with Erdogan, we know this, there's been less rhetoric, I feel like, out of the U.S. About sanctioning Turkey over importing these missile systems. But there's been so much over the past year or so that I find it hard to believe that they're just going to sit by and do nothing. But maybe that's the position they find themselves in, where Turkey has called the bluff in that, they're not willing to continue to play the game. They're just going to bail out and say, cutting Turkey out of the F-35 is enough of a punishment for this crime. So that's the only action we're taking, and no sanctions will be applied to Turkey. Or Trump tomorrow could tweet out that we're raining down sanctions on Turkey for this and they must ship all of it back, and say no to Russia. Wrapping up with the story from Somalia, bad news there, where Al-Shabaab carried out a attack on a hotel that was housing some Westerners, typical style where they detonate a suicide bomber at the gate to get past the guards. They go in and invade the hotel. I guess they were in control of the hotel for several hours, ended up killing several people from overseas, including, I believe, a couple of Americans and a Canadian radio show host. So that's really sad that continues to happen in Somalia, but the U.S. is continuing to fuel the war there. And step one should be the U.S. leaving, and then, the Somali government, in whatever way can negotiate with Al-Shabaab, try to bring some kind of resolution to that country where at least they'll stop killing each other a little bit more. All right, wrap it up for today. Hope you liked the show. Foreign Policy Focused at libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, checkpointasia.net, at KYAAALE on Twitter. Check out the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus.